Hey, welcome to those that are joining me. We are just getting our technology hooked up for a second here. Okay. Looks like we are rocking and rolling now. I am going to spotlight myself. So just a reminder to those of you who might be joining me for the first time, or who might be watching this on the replay. This is a live Q&A that I offer to my online students twice a month, usually on the first and third Thursday of the month, depending on the calendar. And you can add the calendar for these calls to your Google Scheduler. There is a link inside your student dashboard to do that. So if you do add it to your calendar, you'll receive all the reminders and notifications. So usually what I like to do is I try to address questions that were offered in advance, and that link is also available inside your student dashboard. And I will try to address them as we go along. And I create moments of rest and pause between questions and answers so that I can make sure I'm addressing the questions and inquiries from people who are joining me here live. So with that, I am, in the interest of time, I'm just going to dive right in to the questions that we received. And my helper here, Bezam, is my virtual assistant and helper here. Bezam, I'm going to make you the co-host just so that you can let people in case I don't see them and I'm explaining something. So if you have a technical question or something like that, you can also message Bezam, and she is the co-host for our presentation today. All right, so I am just going to dive right in. And let's see, we had a lot of questions today, particularly around things like avoidant attachment. Okay, so the first question we had, do avoidant partners blindside you and break up with you if they really start to have feelings for you? And if so, do they ever come back? Okay. So avoidant partners can distance themselves or end relationships when they start to feel like their feelings are intensifying, for sure. And that is because those strong feelings start to trigger a fear of vulnerability. And so that spirals into needing to protect themselves in order to avoid emotional risk, right? So they start to pull back. Sometimes maybe that looks like breaking up with you or asking for space, that kind of thing. It can appear to be sudden and unexpected sometimes. They could come back, but it really depends on certain factors, like how much self-awareness and personal growth have they done? What is the real strength of the emotional connection that is being created here? Also, how well is the communication going on between the two of you? Are you both able to articulate and set boundaries? And are your words and your actions consistently matching up with each other, yours and theirs, right? So if they decide to come back, you want to make sure that all of those things are in place and or at least in process of being addressed. Otherwise, you're just going to wind up circling back to the same kind of self-protective spiral and mechanism going on. So you just want to remember that your emotional well-being is super important, and a healthy relationship is going to require both partners to show up with some level of understanding and support for each other's needs, even when you might be feeling emotionally vulnerable. Because if you blow up the relationship every time you feel emotionally vulnerable, number one, it's going to create a pattern of instability. So nobody's going to feel safe. So the level of intimacy that you can achieve is always going to come up against a wall, right? And you're also going to create a pattern of intermittent reinforcement, meaning there will be these tremendous highs when you get back together, and then the lows when you're apart. And then when you get back together, it's going to be those highs again. And this creates a pattern of intermittent reinforcement that leads to addictive patterns, like a gambler at the slot machine, for example. Okay. So you want to try to even things out as much as you can. I hope that answers that question. The second question, why do avoidant partners focus on flaws? What if the ratio is 1 to 5, where the flaws are only 1 and the positives are 5? Okay, so in essence, why do avoidant partners focus on flaws when the flaws are relatively minor or infrequent? So avoidant partners are going to focus on flaws because of this fear of underlying intimacy and emotional vulnerability, right? When they highlight the negatives, even if the positives highly outnumber the negatives, it can be in service to a defense mechanism that creates that emotional distance. And so in their experience, emotional safety, right? So it helps them maintain that sense of control, and it prevents them from becoming too close or feeling like they are too dependent on someone else. So by fixating on flaws, we protect ourselves from what we might think is the potential pain or hurt of getting rejected or failing the relationship in some way, right? And this is really what characterizes having an avoidant attachment style. So if we can recognize that there's that pattern of focusing on flaws going on, then just in the awareness, we can start to shift that pattern and look at where is that focus coming from, what part is articulating itself here, and then now we are able to address that part directly and find out what that part needs in order to relinquish that habit, right? This is what I like to approach this through the lens of what's called parts work in internal family systems theory, but realizing that the part of us that wants connection, let's call that the exile or the inner child, is often blended with a part that fears it. And this would be our protector part, right? Who steps in to create these mechanisms that prevent us from really taking a risk on experiencing those things because it could lead to rejection, right? Or pain at some point. So to make it more succinct, they focus on flaws to maintain some level of emotional distance and to avoid the risk of being emotionally vulnerable, right? If it's flawed and it ends, oh, well, then it was flawed to begin with anyway, right? Well, that's okay. I can let it go because they weren't so great anyway, right? They can tell themselves that and it can feel justified. Okay. And again, for those of you that are joining me here live, if you have any questions, thoughts, reflections coming up, or you resonate with this, I invite you to share that in the chat. And I will take moments of rest. Hello, Elle. Hello, Bizam. Thank you for joining me. Sure. Okay. So our next question, trucking right along. My dismissive avoidant partner was about to discard me, but then he stopped, cried, and seemed relieved not to do it. Does that mean that he loves me? Okay. Okay. So while this behavior doesn't necessarily guarantee that he loves you, depending on how you are defining love, it does indicate that there might be some deep feelings there, right? And he's probably struggling with the avoidant protective mechanisms and tendencies that are coming up. And so the tears and the relief might suggest that he is conflicted, right? And cares more than perhaps he deeply allows himself to do or typically allows himself to do. And so as a result, these protector parts, right? These parts that are concerned about getting hurt are coming up. And so a moment of vulnerability like this can demonstrate that he values the relationship, but it also kicks up all the fears about losing it, right? So it's crucial to really approach a situation like this with compassion. Also, some awareness that the conflict that's coming up is usually from an internal projected drama, right? An old story that's being triggered by the new scenario. And that old story may have little to nothing to do with you. But it did install some pretty painful beliefs and habitual coping patterns that are now being affected by or being illustrated in the relationship, right? So the avoidant behavior probably stems from a fear of intimacy and vulnerability, which means that he probably needs time to sift and sort through and support a process of going through those emotions, acknowledging them, and finding healthier ways to process them so that he makes enough room inside to connect with you and invite you into his emotional life and world, right? So in other words, he needs to be doing the work on himself so that when love shows up, he is allowing it in. So things like open and honest communication, including things like boundaries, right, can help you kind of navigate a challenging dynamic like that so that you don't get sucked in to playing the role of whatever projection he is giving to you, right? If you don't have it already, I'd recommend my Courageous Communication program for that. And also, of course, professional counseling if possible, right, to help you navigate that. Okay. Next question. I feel like the avoidant person that I dated had a mask on. Is that common? Okay. So yes, that's quite common for someone with avoidant attachment. I would add it's quite common for someone with insecure attachment, right? Just in general, but I'm going to focus on avoidance since that's the nature of the inquiry. So it is common for avoidant partners to appear to have a mask on. So avoidant attachment really leads people to present in more of a guarded, kind of emotionally controlled version of themselves, right? To protect against vulnerability and that emotional intimacy. So this mask that they're wearing can make them seem kind of distant or indifferent, or, oftentimes people call this emotionally unavailable. And so they hide their true feelings to avoid those deep connections as a way to maintain that safety and what they experience as personal autonomy. So the behavior really stems from that fear, again, of getting hurt and rejected, which can make expressing their emotions when they have them pretty challenging, as well as even being able to accurately identify and name whatever it is that they're feeling. And this is a defense mechanism to keep other people at arm's length, right? And prevent the discomfort that comes with closeness, because we don't really know how to negotiate our boundaries because we spent a lot of time cutting ourselves off from our feelings, which inform our boundaries, right? So if you feel like the person that you dated was wearing a mask, then it is likely to be a manifestation of their avoidant attachment style, but also reflecting that internal struggle with wanting to trust, but then not being able to, wishing you could express your feelings, but then being afraid to, right? So when we can understand that dynamic, then that can help us kind of approach the complexities of dating someone with avoidant attachment with a little more savvy, right? And also being able, again, to set healthy boundaries for ourselves in that scenario. Okay. I'm just going to pause there. Any questions or thoughts or reflections coming up? Or does anybody relate to these questions? Has anybody been in a similar situation before? If you're interested or willing to share in the chat, I'd love to see your feedback on that. Okay. We have another question here. How is having a mask of different than accessing a different side of you as according to your, I'm not sure what IFL stands for. How is having a mask on different than accessing different side of you as according to your IFL? I don't know what IFL stands for, so let me know what that means. So there is internal family systems theory. Okay. So in internal family systems theory, you would just be accessing different parts of yourself, right? So Jung is probably a better reference for talking about masks because it was often associated with the persona, right? So that we develop a persona, a sort of personality or character that we acquire in order to navigate different facets of life and to effectively compartmentalize what we must in order to get our needs met. So the person you are when you're at work could be different than the person you are when you're at home, could be different than the person you are in a romantic situation, different than the person who is on vacation and going hiking, different than the person who doesn't have a lot of work stressors. Who we are when we're stressed may be different than who we are when we're relaxed. So the idea is that your mask or your persona, you're able to kind of switch out these different roles that we play. So it's not quote unquote unhealthy to have a mask per se, that it actually allows us to sort of navigate relationships in society. And we might argue that the mask is sort of like a collection of the different parts that work in the greatest collaboration or harmony in that circumstance, right? So let's say at work, you have a persona that resources the hardworking part, right? It's a managing part that's a hard worker. It might source the communicative part, the part that's a good communicator and able to put your words together very well. Might source the part that's able to suppress emotional impulse and be able to access gratification, delay personal gratification, because that is going to get you much further in a workplace than behaving impulsively, right? So your persona is going to be a collection of different parts that, let's say, in given your context, are best served in that context, right? Or best serve you in that context. So the mask can be healthy when the mask becomes a impediment, let's say, or when the mask prevents you from accessing what you might otherwise want to access. Meaning in the context of this question, let's say we have an avoidant partner who feels big feelings and they like the big feelings, but the big feelings also stimulate fear. So whatever mask they're choosing could become kind of rigid in the sense that, well, we're going to access the fear mask, right? We're, instead of accessing the persona that might allow for more openness, might allow for more self-expression, might allow for more relaxation and sensuality and a generous spirit where we can contribute to someone else's experience and be inquisitive, right? So in IFS, we would call that self energy, that the mask is too rigid and it's cutting us off from self energy, which I would call the spiritual self, the spiritual core of you. And that is defined by its capacity to be curious, to be caring, to be creative, to be exploratory, to be generous, right? That there's more of a broader perspective that the core spiritual self, or self energy in IFS would call it, brings to the table. And so in a relationship, if we're accessing a rigid mask as opposed to core self energy, then we're going to be more defended, right? We're going to start seeing those insecure patterns, activating strategies, deactivating strategies. We're going to start seeing those aspects of ourselves that feel like we need to control the situation because our survival system is kind of kicked on, right? So the mask we're going to put on in that case, if we are demonstrating more insecure behaviors, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, is probably going to be rigid. So it's not that we don't want masks. It's that we want masks that serve us instead of hinder us, right? Masks can also sometimes, depending on a context, masks can also give us permission. So this is why ritual is so powerful. Like, and sometimes we can go into a ritual where we put on a mask, and now we can become some aspect of ourselves that we're not comfortable being without it, right? And so this is why I say, masks are not all bad, because masks can also be gateways. We put on a mask and all of a sudden maybe there's a shadow aspect that comes out that we would not otherwise allow it. And we are usually in a safe and ritualized space. Now we can play with, ooh, here's a part of myself and I can let it come out in this safe container. And also because I've covered my face, so I'm not so concerned about exposure or judgment or what have you. So this is, when we look at things like drama therapy is highly effective for things like this, and shadow work and whatnot, and in other forms of creative arts therapies. So I think we also work with masks in my anxious attachment course. We have a mask, inside outside mask practice, which is another way of looking at what is the dual nature of the masks that we wear, right? And I would also add that when we are looking at this through the question about the avoidant partner wears the mask, remember, from their perspective, the mask is not hindering them, right? The parts that created that mask created it because it was the most effective and functional way to be in the context in which it was originally conceived and created. So it's not hindering them from the perspective of the part that created it, or the parts that constellate around that mask. So if there is another part that says, yes, it is, because we're not all working together here because I want to be emotionally connected, but this part's not letting me, then that's when we want to go in and we start to do things like inner child healing work and all of that to get all the parts to work in collaboration and recognize the self energy, like the sovereignty of the spiritual self and self energy. That's a great question. Thank you for sharing that, Bezam. All right. Suggestions on how to have an honest communication with a Rolling Stone who tends to withhold physical intimacy in a long-term marriage that's otherwise healthy. I'd like to find a way to have an open conversation without triggering more distance unintentionally. So let me know, what course do you have? because the course that I have, so the course that I'd recommend there is the Courageous Communicator, because it goes through this in tremendous and great detail. So, withholding physical intimacy, that is, so with avoidant partners, when they experience intimacy, right? We have different dimensions of intimacy. There's mental, emotional, physical, and so on. And if you are combining different types of intimacy, it can become increasingly overwhelming. So that is why, for example, I find that a lot of avoidant partners land themselves in long distance relationships because there's sort of a built-in safety net, right? There's a built-in gap. And so there's a lot of room and space in the text and voice and FaceTime exchanges. There's a lot of time and space in between to fill up with what we want, to fill up with what we fantasize, right? And that fantasy gives us a lot of room and space to experience what we otherwise do not allow ourselves to experience, right? So in the situation of a marriage, you've combined all levels of intimacy, or that's the intention anyway. So sometimes what happens is a part of intimacy that may be the most triggering can get turned off in order to service the continued function of all the other forms of intimacy, right? And so somewhere in there, it was decided that the other forms are probably more important. So we'll turn off this one to make sure the ship doesn't sink, right? And of course, the irony is that sometimes that will sink the ship anyway, right? So this is where honestly you're going to need some outside help, because otherwise it's going to be a very touchy subject no matter what you say into. But in terms of communication, particularly with avoidant partners, you want to be working with soft strategies explicitly. So soft strategies are when we are approaching the conversation from a place of appreciation and respect for someone's autonomy. So instead of saying, I'm not getting what I want and you need to give it to me, it's more like, I really love when you do this and it lights me up in these ways, and I love to feel lit up like that. I just want more of it, right? And so there's ways to sort of formulate those kinds of communications, and that's what the Courageous Communicator gets into in depth, is like, what are those formulas, and some scripted examples and things like that. But in essence, but I would say in this case, if that's the thing that's kind of turned off, then that's something you're probably going to need a little more support with, because there's also we also often have a lot of shame and performance anxiety and things tied up in that particular area. So I'd probably recommend like a sex therapist or someone who is well trained in something like IFS, internal family systems theory and communication. The Gottman Institute also has a pretty good Gottman Institute or emotionally focused therapy are also really good paradigms for couples in working out things like this as well. My Courageous Communicator program has, I think, 6 or 7 recorded demos of how you could approach this from within the paradigm of attachment styles and what I consider to be like creative arts approaches and energy healing. So my approach is a little bit offbeat, but could definitely be used in combination or in supplement to one of those forms of therapy that I recommended. Hope that's helpful. Okay, great. All right, so I'll hop back on over here. So my dismissive avoidant partner messaged me after 6 months and said that he misses me. Does that mean that he wants to get back together? Okay. So when a dismissive avoidant partner messages you after a period of 6 months or something in and around that amount of time, and they say that they miss you, it does not necessarily mean that they want to get back together. Because if they really truly wanted to rekindle a relationship, they would have messaged you in such a way that you don't have to question their intentions, right? So I miss you is usually a form of fishing. It's a way of really trying to, I would argue, get some form of validation or have their esteem boosted or their loneliness alleviated without having to really commit to any kind of real change or action, right? Maybe they're open to exploring the idea of connecting more deeply again, but if they are doing it in this way, then it's usually with the intent to see if you're going to make all the effort, right? Which is most likely going to be a repetition of why it is that you broke up in the first place. So it's more likely, again, that they're just seeking to boost their self-esteem or to ease their loneliness in some fashion. You know, if they really wanted something more serious, you wouldn't be wondering about it. You would know. So if you are looking for more of a clear effort for someone to rekindle a relationship, then you want to make sure that they are offering more than a, I miss you before you start taking them seriously. Okay. The next question, should I call to break up with them or should I wait until they reach out? Okay, so if you feel like a relationship is no longer healthy or fulfilling for you, then it might be better to take the initiative and call to break up with them if they've just been non-responsive or ghosted you for whatever reason, right? So waiting around for them to reach out is not likely, especially if things aren't going well. Waiting for them to reach out to process it and talk it out with you is probably not going to happen. Okay. And because of that, it's just prolonging your own discomfort and it's kind of leaving you powerless in the situation. So if you know that you want to break up with this person, just taking control of the situation kind of allows you to set those clear boundaries and communicate your feelings more directly in service of your self-advocacy, right? Rather than waiting for them to set the tone. And that can provide a deeper sense of closure for you so that you can move forward. Now, on the other hand, if you both agreed upon a certain period of separation because you wanted to figure things out independently so that you could come back together and discuss the resolution or the dissolution of the relationship, in that case, I would recommend respecting the amount of time that you both agreed to and to wait. Because that's going to give you both the time that you agreed upon to reflect on your feelings in the situation, which could potentially lead to a more thoughtful and informed and productive discussion when you come back together. Because you don't always have to decide everything on your own. You can come to some realizations about what you do want and value. And then when you come back together, find out if there's some kind of wiggle room, compromise, or negotiation that can be made in the process of discussing it, right? But if you jump the gun because you come to some conclusion on your head, inside your own head, and then you want to just break it up with them, that's kind of an impulsive response, and it's speaking from a place of fear, right? So there's really two different scenarios there. If it's a situation where you're being sort of iced out or ghosted, and you're waiting for them to kind of show up so you can get closure, it's not likely to happen. On the other hand, if there was a pre-existing agreement where you're going to take time off and then come back together, then I would recommend respecting your agreement. Okay. I mean, ultimately, the choice really just depends on what are the personal needs and, of course, the specific dynamics of that scenario and your relationship. Let's see. From my experience with DA, I broke up with that's no matter how much time it's been, they will still be attracted to you, but it gets into their other kinds of relationships where they can have the upper hand and not be emotionally intimate and pursue those. So sometimes there is the occasion where someone who has more of an avoidant attachment style will kind of goes back to what I said before about there's many different levels of intimacy, and depending on which one triggers them the most, that might be the one that gets turned off first so that the other forms of intimacy can be functional. So if emotional intimacy is the thing that gets the most lit up with someone, and that is the thing that caused the most destabilization for them, then it may be that that's the one they turn off. And in other relationships, other forms of intimacy become prioritized. Like, we don't fight a lot. We agree on things. We have similar vision for the future. We like the same amount of time apart. We both have our independent interests and hobbies, and things just kind of go smoothly, and nothing seems to really rock the boat. And so they may commit to something that's less emotionally challenging because all these other things go much more easily, right? Whether or not that's the best thing for them, we don't know. I mean, their soul and God knows that, but it is likely to be a relationship that is less challenging for them, right? And sometimes it depends on what they're here for. This is kind of gets into someone's purpose is not the same thing as their potential, right? So sometimes we are here to serve a purpose that isn't tied to our potential, because what is our, I mean, we all have infinite potential. We are all divine sparks, expressions of source energy. So whatever your attachment style might be, whatever traumas you've experienced, we all have a divine potential within us. But is that our purpose here? Because in the eyes of source, all experiences are worthy of investigation. So the experience of fulfilling one's potential is one experience. The experience of not fulfilling one's potential is the other, and we cannot understand one without the other. And since we are all an expression of source, we all will go through, I'm going to argue, lifetimes of fulfilling and not fulfilling potential. So if emotional closeness and intimacy is one form of potential, perhaps someone entered into your life to reject that potential, for you to realize, no, that is one of my purpose is to fulfill that potential in my lifetime. Right. So it's likely, if that is part of your curriculum, that you will encounter someone who rejects it. Right. Because that jettisons you on your next step towards the fulfillment of that. So we may encounter partners who reject the emotional intensity and intimacy that they experience with you, and then opt for someone who doesn't challenge them as much in that way, so that you get to recognize, no, this is what I do want. Right. And maybe that means they won't experience the depth of intimacy in the subsequent relationship with this other person that they do with you, but maybe that's their purpose, right? And we can let that go, because sometimes people will feel like, oh, I'm abandoning them, or, oh, their life will somehow be less than because they won't have that spark that we do. And I don't want them to suffer in that way. But that's the suffering that you align with. It's not necessarily the suffering that they align with. Right. But sometimes that is the case. Thank you for your questions. You guys, these are great questions. Let's see. So then is it more likely for a severe rolling stone to settle for someone who isn't triggering their intimacy wounds in lieu of a person who fires them up? It's not more or less likely. It depends on what is their purpose. What's their purpose? We can't know. Only they and God know. And they probably don't even fully know either, because none of us do, because then we would just lay down and die. So it's something that's always evolving, and it's always growing, and it's not something we ever fully know. Otherwise, it wouldn't serve its purpose. What it does depend upon is what stage of change are they in, and what stages of growth are they here to navigate. So there are people who have no conscious awareness of why they do what they do, or why they feel what they feel, and they just sort of, I call this the wandering phase, but in the stages of change, we might call this the pre-contemplative phase. So this is where we're just sort of wandering around. We're kind of like ping pongs. We kind of bump up against our conditions. We just sort of look to the people around us and the circumstances we're in to dictate who we are, what we do, what we want, what we can get, what's realistic for us, what's not realistic for us. And oftentimes this is a pretty painful way to be, because there's very little agency or control that we feel that we have. And so we find ourselves, we're not really concerned why we feel that we the way we feel. We just know that we feel it, and we must satisfy it, and we want to feel justified in whatever actions we take to satisfy it. And so this is a very, usually these are very early experiences, kind of egocentric way of moving through the world. And some people will remain in that state their entire lives. And I would argue that then there's some purpose they are fulfilling in that. Then after that, we have the contemplative phase. The stages of change would refer to it. I call this the exploring phase. And this is when, usually it's pain that jettisons us into this phase. I don't want to feel this way anymore. I'm sick of it. I feel like I've been feeling this a lot, and I'm starting to wonder, like, what's the common thread here? And I don't want to feel this again. So I think I'm going to take on some responsibility for finding out how I can prevent this from happening again. And this is when we start exploring. So rather than wondering, now there's more intention. So now we're exploring. And so in the contemplative phase, we're starting to think more, we're starting to become more aware, right? And we may also start to take some planning actions. So this is, now we're moving into planning. Well, I'm contemplative, well, now I'm preparatory and I'm planning. So preparatory and planning means you are gathering information. You are calling a counselor, you're reading a book, you're watching a YouTube video, you are making plans to do something, right? I talk to a lot of clients who will say, yeah, I know this, but I'm not ready to blah, blah, blah. Or yeah, I get that, but I'm just not ready to yada, yada. So those are people who are in the contemplative phases and moving into the preparatory phases. And so then when you start making plans, you're preparing. And then when you take action, you are in what I call the discovering phase. You've discovered what plans you want to make. You've discovered what would be the next step, and you take it, right? Now you are taking action. So regardless of whatever attachment style you might have, unless you are in this like exploring or discovering phases, you're not likely to really affect any kind of change. So I mean, it doesn't really matter what attachment style you have. What matters is what phase of change are you in. And that dictates, you know, if someone moves from an avoidant position to a more secure position, from an anxious position to a more secure position. Now, then we have to define, well, what is a more secure position? It does not mean that you eliminate your avoidance. It does not mean that you eliminate your anxiety. It means that you change your relationship to it. So I know I have this avoidant part of myself. And when my partner flares up and starts using controlling language and critical language towards me, I feel a constriction happen inside of me. There's my avoidance. And it's just one of my teachers in this lifetime. And it's one of the radio dials that I push, or that is pushed inside of me, so that I can spin my pearl around that grain of sand and learn the wisdom that stems from it, so that I can, after I die, go back to source and report back, right? So whoop, there's my avoidance again. Ooh, that does not feel great, but good thing that I've learned how to sit with discomfort, and good thing I've learned how to recognize what it's like to feel constriction in my body, and good thing I've discovered a few tools that I can implement with my body to create a rubber band around that feeling, not to eliminate it, but to stretch my capacity to hold it. And now I've got all this good information flowing through. I'm not capping it off anymore. I'm letting it flow through. Same thing with anxiety, right? Ooh, I just felt my energy, want to reach out and punch out and grab for and all this. And now I know how to hold that anxiety in my body. Now I know how to feel that tentacle feeling. And now I know that I can be strong and centered and grounded in myself, and I can withdraw my tentacles if I want. I can hold them and let them wiggle all they want without allowing them to dictate my next action or the next words coming out of my mouth. And I can recognize that when I'm feeling controlling or I'm grasping for a connection, it's really just about needing to connect into myself again, so that I can find that place of endless, abundant source energy and bring that to the table, and recognize that what I'm asking for is not inappropriate, right? But rather something that's going to allow me to make a discerning decision about the level of investment going on here, right? So this is, what stage of change are we in that allows us to inhabit that, right? So someone who's willing to engage in that as a process is someone who has the potential for growth within themselves and within the context of a relationship, because it's always a figure eight, right? This is the whole, the attachment lingo calls that co-regulation, but I'm able to hold that inside, which means now I can hold in the relationship, which means now I can hold it inside, which means now I can hold it in the relationship, which means now I have a resource inside, which means now I have a resource for the relationship, right? Oftentimes we're just figuring out, usually based on your context and whatever you're experiencing in the moment, what wrench are we going to throw in a wheel that got stuck, right? So is the stuck wheel inside here, or is the stuck wheel outside there? And because, of course, if it's stuck out there, it's stuck in here. If it's stuck in here, it's stuck out there. But which wheel are we going to address first? And usually that just depends on your temperament, right? What some part of you is willing to allow first. What part of you? Some people, it's psychoeducation. Usually it's psychoeducation, right? I need to gather enough psychoeducation to persuade my parts to let me feel the feelings I don't want to feel, so that I can let them move, so that I can get at the good stuff behind them, that I can inhabit a wider range of emotion, which allows me to feel through life rather than think my way around it and experience this kind of disconnect from everything and everyone, including myself, right? So it's kind of like, I like to use the metaphor of like when you unclog a drain, you know, the water runs brown with all kinds of like plaque and refuse and all the things that got gunked up behind it. But then after the water runs brown for a while, it runs clear. And that is when you really step into that feeling of, oh, so I've allowed myself to feel uncomfortable feelings, which means I'm not afraid of uncomfortable feelings anymore, which means I'm not afraid of any feeling anymore, which means I have access to all possible feelings, which means, man, I got a lot of power. I have a tremendous amount of power and influence, and I can walk into any situation. And no matter how uncomfortable or off-putting or annoying someone is, doesn't faze me, because I know how to deal with that feeling. I know how to deal with the feelings that come up in response to someone else's annoyance. They're annoyed. Ooh, they made me annoyed. But I know how to feel. I know how to deal with my own annoyance. My own annoyance isn't going to control me. What power I have, right? That's very attractive. That's magnetic, right? I didn't have to eliminate any of my anxiety or my avoidance in order to do that. In fact, I had to embrace them in order to do that. I had to let them be. So it's all the scrambling we do, trying to stop things that gets us into trouble. All right. So, okay, we have some time left. Okay. There is no physical intimacy anymore with my avoidant partner. He backed off after 4 months. We've been together for 1 year, and we just talk and hang out now. What gives? Okay. So in this case, it kind of sounds like the partner's behavior could be rooted, again, in a fear of intimacy and vulnerability. We kind of touched upon this a little bit earlier. But let's say after the initial 4 months, maybe there was a sense during that time that it was really exciting, right? And things felt more secure and things felt like they were evolving. And as things evolve, which is natural, you know, there are natural phases of development in any budding relationship. As things start to evolve, they start feeling a pressure created by the deeper and deepening emotional connection that's going on. So that fear can lead to particularly avoidant individuals starting to back off from whatever is inducing the deeper levels of intimacy. So in this case, perhaps it was physical intimacy, and that is going to protect themselves from whatever they perceive to be the risks of getting too close. Incidentally, it's not always physical intimacy. Sometimes physical intimacy is the safest form of intimacy, and then they back off from other forms of intimacy, right? Like emotional intimacy or a mental intimacy or whatever it is. And so in the avoidant partner's mind, when we can maintain that certain distance, that helps them to feel more in control and safe, even though it is creating this confusion and frustration in their partners. So that shift to just talking and hanging out without the physical intimacy can be their way of managing the anxiety that they feel about the relationship becoming too serious or intense, right? So you don't want to like let these things go unacknowledged or unaddressed. You really want to make sure that you address them. I mean, compassionately and taking into consideration the sensitivities to their triggers and their attachment styles, but you want to make sure they go addressed, because they do not go unaddressed, right? And you can ask them how they feel about the relationship. You can inquire about the lack of intimacy with an air of curiosity, not criticism, right? And perhaps that conversation can provide some insights if they're willing to share about their fears. But it's also really important to ensure that your needs are being articulated and addressed in the relationship, right? Because this one is a particularly sensitive topic, I usually recommend that you get some kind of professional help from a sex therapist in particular. That can be monumentally helpful in a case like this, especially one that is trauma informed and also attachment informed. Okay. Do dismissive avoidant partners realize that they are in love when they're in a relationship or only after it has ended? Okay. So dismissive avoidant partners have a complicated relationship with their feelings, particularly when they suspect they might have feelings of love or attachment. And so during the relationship, they can struggle to really fully recognize or acknowledge their feelings because of this fear of vulnerability and that tendency to downplay the importance of emotional connections intimately and also just in general. So their focus on maintaining a sense of independence and distance makes it really challenging for them to even recognize what feeling they're having when they're feeling it, let alone the depth of the feeling that they are having when they're actively in a relationship. But it is not uncommon for avoidant individuals to kind of realize that only after the relationship has ended. So meaning once they're no longer in an immediate situation that creates that risk, right? Or that feeling or that threat. And so now they have time and space to kind of reflect on what they felt and also realize what they lost. And it can bring a clearer picture of what their emotions were, including recognizing that perhaps I was in love, or now I know that I was. Okay. And it comes because they no longer feel that immediate pressure, right? The threat of loving someone. Now, of course, that kind of delayed recognition can be frustrating for both parties. And it can also mean that there were some irreparable injuries or wounds that were affected in a breakup like that. And in order to find out this is how you feel, right? But it does highlight the complexities of avoidant attachment style. And if we can be aware of those things, sometimes you might be able to find a way back to each other so long as they are within a stage of change or a readiness and a wanting for change that allows them to make plans and take action on that change, right? Not just repeat a pattern over and over again of breaking up, getting back together, and cycling through, right? I hope that helps. Let's see. Are there ways to create enough space while in the relationship to allow the self-reflection for the DA before it gets to the place of the relationship ending? So this kind of speaks to what I call emotional freedom in relationship. I did a video on my YouTube channel last week or 2 weeks ago, and it was called How to Heal Avoidant Attachment. And we talk about this idea of emotional freedom. And, when a person is with you and they say that they need or want something like space, or even if they are anxious and they say they want more closeness, basically what they're doing is they're trying to find a way to calibrate the energy moving through their body while in your presence. So what they're asking for is they're seeking some nuanced quality of energy. And so really what we want to be asking ourselves is, how is my energy behaving right now and in this space with them? So when avoidant partners say they want space, usually it's just that they want emotional freedom. And what's emotional freedom? It's more room for their energy. And and this is why it's often an issue with anxious and avoidant partners, because anxious partners tend to have a lot of energy. But they kind of grew up receiving the messages that I'm too much because they've got big energy, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it was never really modeled for them. This is how you modulate big energy. This is how you expand around it. This is how you make space for it. This is how you channel it. This is how you make it work for you, right? And so as a result, there's a lot of, in as much as the avoidant partner is cut off from their energy, cut off from their feelings, don't know how to navigate that. So they feel a kind of imploded anxiety. The partner who has the more anxious attachment had the combination of nature and nurture and temperament to reach out with that. So their energy is a little bit more outward moving, right? Not that they can't turn it in on themselves, because they certainly can. And when they do, that usually winds up looking like depression, right? But so what happens is you might be seeing, and I often get this question too, but I'm giving them the space, but I'm giving them all the space they want, and I'm just feeling resentful. Yeah, because because what's happening is the energy is going like this. I'm not saying anything. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just sitting here quietly. I'm giving them all the space that they need. It's fine. It's totally fine. I don't care. When are they going to call me? When are they going to come back? When are they going to move closer to me? Oh, but I need them. I need them. I need them. Don't show it. Don't show it. That's not what they need. They need something else. They need something else, and I'm going to give it to them. I'm not going to be the one that's needy. Right? So this is going on. And I'm sorry, you can have a straight face all you want. They're going to feel it, because avoidant partners typically got that way because regardless of popular opinion, they're usually hypersensitive. These are usually our HSPs, are highly sensitive people, right? And they're going to feel that. You're just going to fill up the room with that. Being quiet with a smile on your face, right? So this is why I say healing attachment injuries is not a psychological process. It is an embodied process, because the body is the first organizer of your energy, right? And so so intellectual insight and psychoeducation is going to inform the parts that protect you. And it's going to convince those parts that there could be another way to do this. And if the body could ease some of that, then those protector parts wouldn't have to work so dang hard, right? So as we start to ease some of that, and I believe that easing that means connecting to your spiritual core energy, or IFS would call this self energy, then you have a natural pump. You have a natural apparatus. You have a spinal column of light and energy all along your chakras that is going to pump that energy in ways that serve you and make you feel connected, and you don't have to spin so fast, right? And also a lot of that spinning happens up here. I was doing it down here, but a lot of it happens up here actually. And so as we start to pump that energy on the body level, it starts, instead of spinning up here, now it's got a movement. It's got a form to follow. It's got a flow. It's got a path, right? And so now that when you're in the space, you're not even thinking about them. You're parallel playing. You're preoccupied with something else that's lighting you up. And so what happens is that creates space in the room, right? And so this is the freedom that they're seeking, because, it may be that their experience was there wasn't enough space for them. Or they were assaulted by other people's input because they were just naturally temperamentally hypersensitive to it. And this is why I say avoidance and anxiety are not so different. They are really just two sides of the same coin, because what I just articulated, I'm sure a lot of avoidant people could say, well, I actually experienced that too, but I shut it off. I shut it down. People don't notice. They think I'm being aloof, right? And a lot of anxious people could say, yeah, I do that. But I'm just trying to do it. I'm just trying to give them what they want. And so the wound, I like to say, is the same. It's just the way that we learn to armor ourselves around it or cope with it by creating a kind of energetic armor just is different. Not so different. I mean, it's not so different because we have these archetypal patterns of watching how it unfolds, like attachment styles. There's other frameworks that look at this, like the Myers-Briggs thing, right? Looking at things like personality diagnoses. They're just archetypal patterns of behavior, thought, feeling, and behavior that we've managed to create an inventory for, right? But that's more or less how I would explain that. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I got a little abstract there. But, what time is it? Okay, we've got 5 minutes. You captured it perfectly. Okay, I'm glad that was helpful. A program to assist with healing this. So, I mean, my course, Anxious Attachment 101, is probably for someone who has more anxiety, is the one that I would recommend for starting out there. The other one would be healing attachment wounds. That one's a little bit more robust in terms of its content, and it also addresses all of the attachment styles together. So those would probably be the two that I'd recommend. Otherwise, we are opening enrollment, or we're closing enrollment for my Hungry Love Masterclass, which is a live group coaching program. We're starting July 9th. Enrollment closes on the 30th. And this is when, we are in the live space together, and I'll be coaching you through a curriculum. It's a 12-step program. It lasts 4 months. We meet every week for an hour. And then you also get 2 private coaching sessions with me. So if you're interested in learning more about that, we're actually doing a live workshop on that this afternoon at 4:30 once we finish our Q&A here. So if you're interested in joining, I'm going to be walking everybody through an experiential activity and my path framework for how we heal hungry love by healing the inner child. So I would invite you to join us if you're able. Otherwise, you can register and we will be sending the replay as well to folks that aren't able to come. Let's see. So we've got 3 minutes left. All right, I can get 1 or 2 more in. Is there any way to tell why a dismissive avoidant has become distant when they will not communicate with you? Okay. I mean, so understanding why an avoidant partner becomes distant can be challenging, especially if they're not willing to tell you, right? Now, common reasons can include things like, as we've mentioned before, maybe there's been an increase in emotional intimacy and that triggers their fears, right? Fears of vulnerability, fears of losing their independence. As a relationship grows or becomes more serious, they can also withdraw because of personal stressors. Maybe there are some kind of past trigger reminded them of a hurtful experience, or maybe it's just their subconscious mind that is trying to preemptively cause the other shoe to drop so they can stop waiting for it, meaning they tend to self-sabotage to avoid some kind of future pain. And that's usually fueled by a fear of not meeting someone's expectations because they don't want to disappoint someone, right? So they end the relationship preemptively so that they can avoid your disappointment or feeling like a failure. And that's usually because they have a pretty sensitive shame wound that's kind of driving the bus, right? So these are just patterns that can offer you some insight, but every individual is unique, regardless of their attachment style. And it's, as I said before, it's not so much that they have an attachment style, it's more their readiness for change, right? So we can approach a situation like that with patience and empathy and try to create a safe space for there to be an eventual dialogue if they do decide to eventually come back and want to, talk to you, right? But the reality is they may never be ready. And so being patient can sometimes allow someone to entertain their defenses without really being challenged to open up. So in the meantime, you can't control what they do or don't do. But what I would recommend you do is take a really brutal self-inventory and ask yourself, why do you want to be with someone who's not willing to communicate? How does that keep you safe? Right. So I would have you reflect on those questions. Okay. And the last one. Do you think it's easier to heal disorganized attachment style while you are in a relationship or while you are single? Okay. So healing disorganized attachment, which is also sometimes called fearful avoidance, can be approached from within a relationship and while being single, because each scenario kind of has its own unique challenges and advantages. So when you're in a relationship, you have this opportunity to really practice new or healthier behaviors in real time. And then you're able to, let's say, resource the container of the relationship for some kind of immediate feedback, right? And so if you have a supportive partner, then they can help provide that space for you, in which you can be playful, make mistakes, in which you can grow and help you kind of navigate your triggers so that you can build trust. And that can be an incredibly powerful experience, especially if your partner is understanding and they're committed to helping you work out those challenges. Now, on the other hand, being single really allows you to focus entirely on your own healing without the added complexity of needing to negotiate relationship dynamics right away, right? So you can dedicate more time to self-discovery, to your own therapy, to building that internal secure sense of self. And so being on that kind of solo journey can be essential for developing a sense of self-reliance, understanding your own agency, understanding your own patterns, and then being able to bring that to a relationship with a little bit more sure footing, right? So ultimately, really the best path depends on what are your circumstances, the level of support that you have, and temperamentally, what you think is going to work for you best, right? Because both approaches can be effective, and ultimately a combination of both, meaning starting with personal work or then practicing in a relationship, that can be beneficial. So I hope that that's helpful. So we have come to the end of our time here today. I just want to say thank you to those of you that showed up with me here live. It's really nice to see your faces. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And again, we are going to have another call in about 30 minutes. I'm going to hop back on Zoom. We're going to be doing a live workshop for healing the inner child. And this is going to be in celebration of our promotion for Hungry Love, which is closing for enrollment on the 30th. So if you're interested, check your email inbox. You should have an invitation there. And otherwise, I will see you for our next live call. Thank you, everyone.